Fred and George Weasley may have looked so similar that even their parents couldn't tell them apart sometimes, and were so close that you unusually saw one without the other. Let's see the 6 differences between Fred and George. Number 6. Fred was mentioned more. Fred Weasley is mentioned over 900 times in the books, almost 200 more than his brother George. George gets around 731 mentions. This could be down to the fact that Fred was the slightly more outgoing of the 2 brothers. And in J.K. Rowling Twitter, she tweeted, "Today I would just like to say I'm really sorry about Fred, but she didn't think people would have expected George to be the one who died." Number 5. George was the better beater. While both Fred and George were excellent beaters and a credit to the Gryffindor Quidditch team, there were more mentions of George hitting bludgers than there were of Fred. George seemed to be the slightly more aggressive of the 2 on the Quidditch pitch. He even had good aim with snowballs. Aggression may, of course, be a very desirable trait in a beater, so it could be this that gave George the edge over his brother. Number 4. Fred was the instigator. Whenever the Weasley twins did something particularly not good, it always seemed to be Fred who took the lead. When the twins and Ron broke Harry out of Private Drive in his 2nd year, it was Fred who was driving the Flying Fort and Gilliam. He was usually the one behind even the smaller pranks. It was Fred who had the unsuccessful idea to use Asian potion to put their name in the Goblet of Fire, and was the first to cross the age line to try it. Fred was also the twin who talked back to Umbridge and started their final flight from Hogwarts. Number 3. George smoothed things over. Fred and George were both undeniably charismatic, but George was, as it were, the public face of the Weasley twins, able to be much more subtle and diplomatic than Fred, and was the one who realized why Hermione wanted to get into the school kitchens. He was even the one who remembered to get to the new common room password from a prefect. Number 2. George was more sympathetic, but Fred was generally funnier. Fred cracked more jokes and one-liners than George did, and was often the first to imitate and mock his siblings. George usually joined in, of course, but he took his cue for what kind of jokes they were making from his brother. On the other hand, George was more compassionate when the time called for it. When Fred was teasing Ron over Scabbard's death, saying it was probably better for him to snuff it quickly, George at least tried to cheer Ron up and reminding him he was always complaining about the rats anyway. And finally, number 1. Fred spoke first and George explained second. When you read through the books, you can see that it was almost always Fred who spoke first. Usually a joke or a dramatic comment, it was the front man, the lead singer, the one who first got everyone's attention. Fred and George really did complement each other perfectly, but it was so sad for us to see one leaving while the other did.